We're here today to continue our committee's work on improving our nation's energy security through offshore energy production. As a superpower of the world, it is vital that we have a reliable domestic energy supply chain that enhances our national security, reduces our reliance on foreign nations, and helps our allies. Offshore energy, which produces 59% of all federal oil production, 19% of all federal gas production, and a growing share of electricity through wind power, is an irreplaceable part of our nation's energy security strategy. In addition, offshore energy plays a key role in our federal budget. In fiscal year 2022 alone, oil and gas generated $6.5 billion in revenue, alongside $4.6 billion in bonus bids for offshore wind. This revenue is also the primary funding source for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the LWCF providing $900 million each year for federal, state, and local conservation funding, benefiting conservation projects in every single state and almost every county in America. Offshore energy also plays a key role in the budgets of coastal states. The offshore industries promote economic activity and provide federal revenue sharing under the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, which distributed $353 million to Gulf states earlier this year, on top of another $125 million for the state LWCF grants. Offshore energy of all types also helps achieve our climate goals. Offshore wind has great potential as a clean energy source if we can overcome the challenges the industry is currently facing, both in permitting and financing these complex projects. Furthermore, federal offshore oil and gas production is among the lowest emitting in the world. According to a report from the consulting firm ICF, displacing overseas oil production with oil from the U.S. Gulf of Mexico could cut emissions in half for each additional barrel of U.S. production. Sadly, this administration has been trying everything it can to discourage development of offshore oil and gas. It's a shame that we are discouraging domestic development while turning a blind eye to Iran's invasion of sanctions of use of its oil revenues to fund terrorism, while at the same time lifting sanctions on Venezuela, encouraging the development of some of the highest emitting barrels of oil in the world. I understand that the goal of lifting sanctions on Venezuela is to ensure that economic and humanitarian conditions improve and ease the flow of migrants to the U.S. But I've seen nothing to indicate that lifting sanctions will lead Venezuela to improve labor conditions, reduce emissions, or anything else that makes U.S. production more attractive. The path this administration is on makes no sense to me at all. Even if this administration was attempting to end federal oil and gas leasing altogether, because of my insistence that the Inflation Reduction Act take a balanced approach to energy security, we are looking at a future that involves at least some continued offshore energy leasing of all types. Before we passed the IRA, it was obvious that the Department of Interior was slow-walking the next 5-year program, while at the same time canceling already scheduled lease sales. To address that, in the IRA, we prohibited Interior from issuing wind and solar leases unless the department also holds significant oil and gas lease sales, both on and offshore. As a result, Interior was forced to include oil and gas lease sales in their recently released 2024 to 2029 leasing program. To be clear, the new 5-year leasing program falls well short of what we should be doing by including only 3 oil and gas sales. This is barely a quarter of what the Obama administration approved for the last 5-year program. But it's clear that we would have gotten exactly 0 without the IRA. Interior press release announcing the new 5-year plan says as much. It states the IRA does not allow the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to issue a lease for offshore wind development unless the agency has offered at least 60 million acres for oil and gas leasing on the Outer Continental Shelf in the previous year. In addition to ensuring leasing continues in the future, the IRA also reinstated Lease Sale 257 and mandated 3 additional offshore sales in 2022 and 2023 that had previously been canceled by the department. When I speak with the offshore energy companies, there is complete agreement the IRA is the only reason oil and gas leasing has proceeded at all. The National Ocean Industries Association stated that the IRA secures an all-of-the-above energy package that boosts offshore oil and gas, offshore wind, and carbon capture and storage. Last fall, an American Petroleum Institute executive stated without the Inflation Reduction Act, without the IRA, there would not be any offshore lease sales until late 2023 at the earliest. But because of the IRA, we have had 3 sales since then, including a record-setting sale in the Gulf, with a 4th scheduled for less than 2 weeks from now. Zooming out, the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law together have created immense demand for energy of all types as we build our physical infrastructure, domestic manufacturing, and industrial base. These bills provide a pathway to continue producing the fossil fuel we need today, more cleanly than ever thanks to incentives for carbon capture, hydrogen, and more, while commercializing the technologies we want for the future. This has given the private sector confidence to invest in all types of energy. As a result, the U.S. will see record production of oil and gas this year, 4.6 billion barrels of oil, 37 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, as well as record additions of solar and battery storage. And when the leases mandated by the IRA begin actually producing next year, the Energy Information Administration is already forecasting those records will be broken again. That said, we will only achieve the full promise of the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law if the administration implements them as Congress intended. Lease Sale 261, which was mandated by the IRA, is a good example where implementation is not living up to the intent of the law. Environmental groups sued NOAA to impose new restrictions related to the rights as well, but only for oil and gas development in the Gulf. And administration capitulated in a settlement agreement, bypassing Interior's normal procedures, adding restrictions, and agreeing to remove 6 million acres from the sale. However, a federal judge then determined that removing the acres in this manner would likely be unlawful, so now the administration has delayed the sale and is scrambling to add the 6 million acres back in. This case proves that trying to rewrite an energy security law passed by Congress through administrative action is not a winning strategy. Because the reality is we will get closer to achieving our shared goals for all types of offshore energy production if we embrace the balanced approach that was written into the IRA. As 10 of my Republican colleagues stated in their amicus brief opposing the Lease Sale 261 restrictions when the lawsuit was entered into, the IRA was the result of considerable deliberation. These are the words. There was considerable deliberation concerning the economic, energy, environmental, and strategic interests of the United States. And the IRA balances diverse, complex, and overlapping considerations, including growth and conservation, domestic needs and global positioning, and security and diplomacy. I couldn't agree more with my friends on the Republican side on this, and I will continue to do everything in my power to ensure that the law is implemented the way it was written in that manner. I'm also pleased that we have Janet Coy, the head of NOAA, with us today to discuss several actions underway related to the rice as well. NOAA's mission is to protect our nation's ocean resources and habitat, which is critical. But we also must look at the broader impacts of the agency's actions on all the uses of our offshore resources. I acknowledge that NOAA is not coming up with these proposals on their own. They are being initiated as a result of lawsuits or petitions from our environmental groups. But I'm very concerned about how the administration has chosen to respond and act on them. Turning to offshore wind, everyone here knows I'm a strong supporter of all the above energy policy. That is why I'm also concerned about the signals that BOEM and NOAA are sending for offshore wind. You want to, you going to put that up sooner or later? We're going to show you what we think we're getting ourselves into right now. We're trying to build out this new domestic offshore wind industry and continue to hear about the importance of providing as much government certainty as possible so that we can unlock billions of dollars in projects that will bolster our energy dependence with tens of thousands of good-paying jobs. By only allowing 3 offshore oil and gas leases over the next 5 years, the administration is creating immense uncertainty for the wind industry. If you look and see the green shows you what's going to happen, and then basically because of only having 3 oil and gas, you're going to be omitting having anything for the next year, where the red is on those years for 24 to 25. Then we have another lease sale, and you have another 1-year hiatus. Then you have another lease sale, 2027, and another hiatus. So they're cutting off their nose to spite their face, is really what it's about, and it shouldn't be done. The chart behind me will show that big risk-taking for the wind because we tied them all together. With only 3 oil and gas lease sales that we just said proposed for the next 5 years, there are going to be several periods of time where no wind leases can be issued. And if any of these 3 oil and gas sales are delayed or shrunk by a lawsuit, below the 60 million acre threshold in the IRA, this could lead to moratorium on wind leasing for as much as 2 or 3 years. That, the administration, would jeopardize our domestic wind industry. It gives them no confidence to invest, and the own goal to build 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 defies explanation and shows an alarming level of incoherence. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses to better understand some of the puzzling decisions that we have seen when it comes to energy security, and find ways to come together on a bipartisan basis to support a strong offshore energy industry in the U.S. I know our members and witnesses are passionate about these issues. I hope that we can all have a civil discussion and debate about offshore energy and our national security, because this issue is too important to the American people to either ignore or politicize, both for domestic and our defense. So with that, I'll turn it over to a ranking member, my friend John Barrasso, for his opening remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. And as you noted last week and again right now, as friends and colleagues, we can agree to disagree on certain items. And before giving you the opening statement, I'd like to address some of your comments on the IRA, because every Republican in Congress voted against the IRA. As a matter of fact, on the floor this week, I described it as irresponsible, reckless, and alarming. That's how I come up with IRA, because it's not resulted in more oil and gas production at this point. In fact, none of the offshore leases associated with it is producing oil or gas at this time. Every Senate Democrat voted against a Republican amendment to the IRA that would have ensured a robust 5-year plan with 11 lease sales. But instead, we're holding this hearing today because the Biden administration is working to choke off all future offshore lease sales. And as you said, Mr. Chairman, and I agree, there are puzzling decisions coming out of an administration that ought to be focused on American energy. But this is what you and I agree, Mr. Chairman, and we need leasing to continue in the Gulf. So I want to thank you for holding this hearing. This morning is a good opportunity to take stock of President Biden's energy policies, which I would describe as disastrous for American energy. Since coming to office, the President has worked tirelessly to undermine America's energy security. Day one, he killed the Keystone XL pipeline. Week one, he blocked new oil and gas leases on federal lands and waters. Last year, the administration failed to finalize a new 5-year offshore oil and gas leasing plan, blatantly ignoring the law of the land. Instead, it canceled 3 offshore oil and gas lease sales. Federal offshore oil production fell nearly 10% from 2019 to 2022. Total U.S. oil production is below what the Department of Energy's prior projections for this year are, by 1.4 million barrels a day. Meanwhile, the President has irresponsibly drained 45% of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The reserve is now at the lowest level in 40 years. This year, President Biden canceled existing oil and gas leases on Alaska's North Slope, and we have the senior senator from Alaska here with us today. These are leases that Congress explicitly mandated in 2017. President Biden now seeks to block access to over 40% of our national petroleum reserve in Alaska. This is the very area whose very purpose is to produce oil. It is our petroleum reserve. Just last month, the administration set forth a 5-year offshore plan that offers the fewest number of oil and gas leases in the history of the program. Next year is going to mark the first time since 1965 that the United States will not hold a single offshore oil and gas lease sale. The first time, Mr. Chairman, in over 50 years. It is in almost 60 years. It's a disgraceful record. During the same time, President Biden lifted sanctions on Nord Stream's 2 pipeline. He has foolishly eased sanctions on Iran. In fact, President Biden has allowed Iran to collect massive amounts of money, billions and billions and billions of dollars from oil exports. He has rejected American energy, repeatedly begged the OPEC cartel to produce more oil. He has pursued a regulatory and spending agenda whose principal beneficiary is our enemy, China. And last week, President Biden disturbingly relaxed sanctions on oil exports from Nicolas Maduro's oppressive regime in Venezuela, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. It is a regime that the United States doesn't even recognize. As Senator Murkowski has stated, it is beyond absurd. So we're now reaping the consequences of President Biden's reckless decisions. Russia continues its brutal invasion of Ukraine, killing innocent people. China grows more aggressive by the day with the help of Iranian oil, and Iran is wreaking havoc in the Middle East. Its terrorist allies are committing atrocities against innocent civilians in Israel and elsewhere. Mr. Chairman, you talk about the need for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This could be the time that we need this energy that has already been squandered by the administration as a result of high gas prices leading up to the last election. Look, 2.5 years ago, we held a confirmation hearing in this room for the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland. At that time, I asked her whether reducing oil and gas leasing on federal lands and waters would decrease the world's total oil production. She said no. So I'm glad we have Ms. Klein here today. She is the director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. She has taken every opportunity, in my opinion, to kill oil and gas leasing on U.S. waters and has boasted about it. Many of us would like to know why she thinks less American oil production makes the world a safer and more secure place for the citizens of our country. Less American oil production doesn't mean the world will produce less oil. It won't reduce global temperatures. It won't affect climate change. Less American oil simply means more Iranian oil, more Russian oil, more oil from Venezuela, more oil from OPEC, and a weaker America. Less American oil production means fewer jobs for American workers, less revenue to the United States. Also means more money to Iran's ayatollahs, more money for Russia's invading army, more money for terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. I think this committee and every American citizen deserves an explanation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. And as you can see, the purpose of a democracy is bringing sides together that have agreed to disagree on certain issues, but basically are looking for the main outcome that strengthens and protects our country. And that's what we do here today. So I'd like to turn now to our panel of witnesses. We have the Honorable Janet Coit, Assistant Administrator for NOAA Fisheries, and we have Ms. Elizabeth Klein, or Liz, Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And Ms. Klein, we will start with you with your opening statement.
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, I'm pleased to appear before you today to discuss the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's efforts to responsibly manage energy resources on the Outer Continental Shelf in a manner that meets the country's energy needs while minimizing impacts to the environment. My name is Elizabeth Klein, and I am the Director of BOEM at the Department of the Interior. The administration is committed to ensuring safe and responsible domestic energy production as we transition to a clean energy future, one that will create good-paying jobs and ensure economic opportunities are accessible to all communities. This includes moving forward with the next National OCS program and meeting the administration's goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act requires BOEM to prepare and periodically revise an oil and gas leasing program that includes a proposed schedule of oil and gas lease sales for the 5-year period following approval of the program. This is, of course, referred to as the National OCS Program or 5-year plan. As specified by Section 18 of OXLA, preparation and approval of a National OCS program is based on the Secretary of the Interior balancing specific requirements and factors when selecting the size, timing, and location of OCS lease sales that best meet regional and national energy needs, while also considering impacts from oil and gas exploration on the marine, coastal, and human environments. The current proposed final program includes 3 potential OCS oil and gas lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico program area, scheduled for 2025, 2027, and 2029. These 3 potential lease sales were chosen because they have the greatest resource potential and net benefits, with the least potentially significant impacts and costs to society. The Secretary believes that this proposed schedule will best meet national energy needs for the next 5 years. The area considered for leasing has been narrowed to the Gulf of Mexico, where there is existing production and infrastructure. This area includes the portions of the western, central, and eastern Gulf of Mexico planning areas not currently under presidential withdrawal, the Cook Inlet Program area in Alaska, which has generated low industry interest for many years, included in Lease Sale 258, has not been included in the potential lease sale schedule. Following the publication of the proposed final program and final programmatic environmental impact statement, a 60-day waiting period is required before the Secretary can formally approve the program and finalize a record of decision. The Secretary has committed to issuing a final decision on the next National OCS program by the end of this year. With respect to offshore wind, President Biden has said climate change represents an existential threat of our time and the federal government has a responsibility to act. And so this administration has set bold but achievable goals to harness the significant offshore wind resources we have here in the U.S. by deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2035. In support of these goals, the department has approved the nation's first 4 commercial-scale offshore wind projects on the OCS, with 2 of those projects, Vineyard Wind 1 and South Fork, already under construction. In addition, BOEM has held 4 offshore wind lease auctions totaling almost $5.5 billion in high bids, including a record-breaking sale in the New York Bight area and the first ever sales offshore the Pacific and Gulf of Mexico coasts. BOEM has also taken steps to explore additional opportunities in the U.S., including offshore Oregon and in the Gulf of Maine and Central Atlantic. We are taking a thoughtful, all-of-government approach to collaborating on issues like ocean co-use and efficient permitting to build a robust offshore wind industry that benefits communities and coexists with other ocean users. We will continue to do this by working with our government partners and others to ensure that any future offshore energy development is done safely and responsibly and relies on the best available science and indigenous knowledge. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today to discuss BOEM's efforts to responsibly manage our nation's energy resources on the OCS that will meet the nation's energy needs while minimizing impacts to the human, marine, and coastal environment. BOEM's programs are essential for the administration's continued commitment to ensure a clean energy future, one that is sustainable and benefits all Americans. I look forward to working with the committee on these important issues, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from Mrs. Coit.
Good morning. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. The United States Senate is a familiar place to me. I worked for 3 senators from New England earlier in my career and was counsel to the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, then chaired by John Chafee from Rhode Island. Now, in my position as the head of the nation's National Marine Fisheries Service, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this administration's work to develop offshore energy while supporting fisheries and other ocean uses and maintaining a healthy environment. From the surface of the sun to the bottom of the ocean, NOAA's mission is to help people better understand the world around them so that they're equipped to protect their lives and their livelihoods. Central to our mission is our work to conserve oceans. The fact is, due to the impacts of climate change, our oceans are changing rapidly. NOAA Fisheries is responsible for the stewardship of the nation's living marine resources and their habitats. NOAA Fisheries provides vital services for the nation, all backed by sound science and an ecosystem-based approach to management. The economies of our coastal communities and the resilience of our marine ecosystems depend on healthy oceans. NOAA scientists predict that 2023 is likely to rank as the warmest year on record. This year, a steady climb in ocean temperature caused unprecedented heat stress. For example, waters around southern Florida saw the warmest temperatures on record, reaching highs of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition to direct impacts to human health, extreme heat can be destructive and deadly for marine systems. Last year, the Alaska snow crab fishery, which had $219 million in landings in 2021, was closed for the first time in history due to a sudden dramatic decline in adult and juvenile crabs linked to a marine heat wave. Another phenomenon exacerbated by warmer waters are the dead zones that result when excess nutrients from upland watersheds drain into our estuaries, stimulating algal growth and reducing life-giving oxygen. In the Gulf of Mexico, this year's dead zone affected almost 2 million acres, an area nearly as large as Yellowstone National Park. These dead zones negatively impact tourism, recreation, and damage fisheries and fishing opportunities. At NOAA, scientists are working hard to provide timely data and information regarding climate change within marine and other Earth systems, and to develop near-term and future projections to support all ocean uses. In relation to offshore energy, we're responsible for implementing provisions under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act. This work happens in close collaboration with BOEM, as we are a consulting and an authorizing federal agency on energy projects under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Today, I'm pleased to be here with my counterpart, Director Liz Klein. We've worked together to improve permitting and look for efficiencies in our processes, particularly since NOAA Fisheries has received a surge of applications for offshore energy projects since 2021. Our aim is to support sustainable energy development that reflects the best use of science and working closely with BOEM. Under President Biden, NOAA has requested and received increases to our budget to boost our capacity in permitting offshore energy activity and to increase the efficiency of our regulatory processes. Additional staff capacity is needed to handle the workload, and funds are requested in the FY24 budget. Thanks to funding support already from Congress, in the past 2.5 years, NOAA Fisheries has improved the speed of Section 7 consultations under the ESA, issued 59 Marine Mammal Protection Act authorizations for oil and gas-related activities, and 38 MMPA authorizations for offshore wind-related activities. In coordination with BOEM and other federal agencies, we strive to braid together our respective statutory requirements so as to avoid delays and meet milestones. To reiterate, NOAA is committed to promoting the administration's offshore energy goals while conserving biodiversity and supporting ocean co-use, consistent with the law. As an authoritative source of ocean and coastal environmental intelligence, and with our stewardship responsibilities under multiple environmental laws, NOAA Fisheries plays a critical role in serving the nation's coastal communities and industries and ensuring responsible management of our ocean and coastal resources. Our work with BOEM, tribal nations, and other federal and state agencies to improve coordination of regulatory processes and to support our nation's energy security goals is a top priority for NOAA. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear here, and I also look forward to answering questions in our discussion.
Thank you very much to both of you. As we all know, Senator King can't be here today. He had to go back home with a horrible, horrible tragedy that happened in Maine last night. I'm going to ask his questions on my first 5 minutes, and I'll come back and do mine later, okay? So this is from Senator King. This is to Mrs. Coit. Last year, Senator King included language pausing regulatory action by NOAA that would have been devastating and has had devastating impact on Maine's lobster industry. This pause gives NOAA time to collect accurate monitoring data of North Atlantic right whales and provided funding for new gear to help fishermen further reduce their potential impacts. Can you provide an update on the $40 million in funding for innovative gear development? And also, can you provide an update on the $82 million in the IRA funds to conserve and recover endangered North Atlantic right whales that will be rolled out, provided needed monitoring data on right whales? Where you are on that evaluation and how the money's being spent?
Thank you, and thank you for speaking for Senator King during such a time of tragedy. I've met with Senator King multiple times in regard to supporting the iconic lobster fishery in Maine and doing what we can to better monitor for endangered North Atlantic right whales, and really appreciate the work that he's done to provide funding, as you mentioned. There was $20 million in the Consolidated Appropriations Act that we are working with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to provide grants for fishermen to promote new gear technologies that would reduce harm to whales. And that we've been making great progress. That NFWF, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, plans to announce or make decisions on those grants in November, and they'll be announced later this fall. That was $20 million. Another $20 million of our annual appropriations, we're also pairing with that to promote gear innovations. We're working closely with the state of Maine on expanding monitoring, something that Senator King's very interested in, and we've devoted $82 million of IRA money to promote conservation of right whales. And
you all have accurate records on the right whales, how many have been struck by commercial boating, with recreation and smaller boats? Have you all had that and checked with insurance claims?
You mentioned that earlier this week, and I have not checked with insurance.
That tells
claims.
you everything. If they're hitting them, they're going to be getting insurance.
Yeah.
If they're not getting insurance claims, they're not hitting them.
Yeah. Senator King's.
Can I follow up?
Oh, sure.
Because he had another. I'm
sure.
Make sure I get these in. The recent D.C. District Court opinion, Maine Lobstermen's Association versus NMFS, makes it clear that National Marine Fisheries Service may not rely upon worst-case scenarios or pessimistic assumptions when faced with scientific uncertainty in Endangered Species Act consultations. This is an issue that impacts Maine lobstermen, offshore wind projects, and a myriad of other ocean users. How does the NMFS plan to address the appeals court decision directing the agency to stop using worst-case assumptions in their models, and will you commit to fully comply with the D.C. Circuit Court opinion?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. That case by the district court, of course, we feel is specific to the facts before the court. We are right now, our lawyers are looking at how to interpret that and provide guidance so that we can follow up on the court decision in regard to how we make assumptions, because there's always uncertainties, which the court recognized, but as we are putting together our biological opinions. So we are going to provide guidance to our regulatory team consistent with that court opinion.
Okay. And Ms. Klein, he wants to make sure that you know that he's very pleased with the decisions you all have made and yours on the Lobster Management Area 1. He's not very pleased on some other things here, and we'll get into them, but that he was. He says, I'll make sure to give your appreciation on that. Continue work with the Maine's fishing community is very much appreciated. While no LMA 1 areas were included in the draft wind energy area, BOEM did leave the open possibility of including 3 secondary comment areas that are in LMA 1 in the final wind energy area. The Maine delegation, the governor, and the legislature were very clear in their opposition to including LMA 1 areas, and he'd like to know what BOEM is leaving open this possible backdoor inclusion. Why did they do that?
Well, thank you for the question, and certainly my heart also goes out to the community in Maine dealing with the tragedy of last night. Just with respect to the recent decision on draft wind energy areas for the Gulf of Maine, we did identify 3 secondary areas that we're asking for further input and analysis on, mostly because those areas are closer to shore and so could provide greater opportunity for tie-in to the coastline. And we want to make sure that we give everybody ample opportunity to provide their feedback and comment on whether or not those might be viable in the future. But we certainly appreciate and understand we've received a lot of comment about concerns about lobster management area 1.
From the delegation and the governor, you all have been hearing the opposition they have on some of those considerations, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you both. Now I'll turn to Senator Barrasso for his question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Ms. Klein, the recently released 5-year plan for offshore oil and gas leasing includes the fewest lease sales in history. And your department brags about that. They're very pleased with themselves. This is the headline, your department press release. Reflecting America's rapid and accelerating shift to clean energy, Interior Department announces fewest offshore oil and gas lease sales in history in proposed final program for 2024 to 2029. So that's your bragging, and that's your position. It also suggests that you are holding those fewest sales solely, not for oil and gas, but for the purposes of enabling the offshore wind program to continue. That's what your release says. So in your view, is there any reason ever to hold offshore oil and gas lease sales other than to ensure that the Bureau can hold offshore wind lease sales?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Senator. The proposed final program obviously is a decision by the Secretary based on what she believes to be the nation's energy needs in the next 5 years, based on a number of factors she's required to consider in OXLA. The Inflation Reduction Act gave us very clear direction about how we link oil and gas lease sales to the offshore wind program, and we've proposed the minimum number of sales needed to continue to expand our offshore wind leasing program into the future. The President's made clear that climate change is a crisis that he believes the federal government has a responsibility to do something about, and the transition to clean energy is something that this administration is very focused on.
So it sounds like you, as director of our nation's offshore oil and gas program, actually doesn't think there should be any offshore oil and gas program. Ms. Klein, the Biden administration is now lifting sanctions on Venezuelan oil. This is the administration that you just talked about. Now, the oil produced in Venezuela ranks among the worst in the world in terms of carbon intensity, while production in the Gulf of Mexico is among the best. Is it better for the environment for oil to be produced in the Gulf of Mexico or in Venezuela?
Well, thank you for that question. I think the documents and the analytical documents contained as part of the proposed final program go into some detail about the emissions associated with Gulf of Mexico oil development. We walk through that, and we agree that the analysis shows that the emissions are lower for upstream production associated with Gulf of Mexico oil and gas resources. When you consider the full life cycle emissions of upstream and downstream production, the numbers are different. And, the proposed final program from the Secretary's perspective meets the energy needs for the next 5 years.
So oil from Iran, oil from Russia also rank near the bottom in terms of carbon intensity. I mean, you're summa cum laude from college, summa cum laude from law school. This is a simple question. Is it better for the environment for oil production if it occurs in the Gulf of Mexico or Iran and Russia and Venezuela? Which is what the president is asking for and allowing.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think a lot of the feedback we received is that it might be better for the environment if we transition to clean energy sources.
So you're refusing to answer the if for or, but what you're saying, the president's decision to go to Iran, to go to Venezuela, to go to Russia is okay and better because you're shutting it down in the Gulf of Mexico, so we just don't have it here. So the administration's efforts to choke off new oil and gas lease sales on federal lands and waters, they're bad for our national economic security. They're bad for the environment. These anti-American energy policies are more than misguided. They are shameful, and you're smart enough to know that. Ms. Coit, last month, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management attempted to impose major travel restrictions on ships servicing oil and gas operations in the central and western Gulf of Mexico in order to protect Rice's whales. I would note that ships servicing oil and gas operations make up less than 10% of the total ship traffic in the Gulf. That means 90% of the ship traffic, nothing to do with oil and gas production. Can whales tell the difference between the ships servicing oil and gas operations and other ships?
Turn your mic on, ma'am.
Thank you again for that question. The endangered Rice's whale, one of the threats to that whale is from ship strikes, vessel strikes, and the opportunity for us to mitigate those impacts occurs when we consult with other federal agencies. We're trying to reduce threats to the unendangered whale as required under the Endangered Species Act.
But you didn't answer the question. Is there any rational basis for imposing restrictions on the ships that service the oil and gas operations, but not on the other 90% of the ships that travel in the same area?
I believe the rational basis is that under the Endangered Species Act, we're dealing with federal agency actions, and most of those other other ships are not going to be something that's approved by the federal Department of the Interior.
It's not then a rational decision. You feel you're mandated by law to do that, but it's not because those 90% of the ships that are still allowed to go are safer ships than the other 10% that are the oil and gas ships. Okay. So this chart shows all of the confirmed suspected sightings of the Rice's whale last 20 years. The black dots are confirmed sightings. Most of them are over there where we see the Florida coast and under Alabama. There's this one dot way over here by Texas. An enormous gap between the sighting and the whale's known habitat off the coast of Florida. We know they're over there. We know that and understand that. Is it your position that activities in areas where there have been no confirmed sightings at all, they need to be restricted too in order to protect the Rice's whale?
The Western Gulf has just a few sightings, as you state. It also we have a record of passive.
Well, there was one sighting, and it was 6 years ago. Yeah.
Well, we've actually believe we've seen a bunch this last summer as well, and we have passive acoustic monitoring that demonstrates that there are Rice's whales there. They have a distinctive call, and they are there 12 months of the year in the Western Gulf. So we're confident from the latest and best available science that they are in the Western Gulf.
So do we need to block off all this area in between? I just want to clarify.
It looks like your map is related to our proposed critical habitat, and that is not blocking off the area. It's simply identifying habitat that's important for their feeding and survival.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. Thank you.
Senator Heinert.
Ms. Klein, I wanted to go back to Vineyard Wind 1 and South Fork. What are the timelines for, I know the construction has started on those projects. Is there a general timeline for completion of those two projects?
Well, thank you for that question. South Fork is a smaller project than Vineyard Wind, and so they are further along in completing their project. Vineyard Wind is moving along as expeditiously as they can. They've run into weather issues, but feel that they are going to complete their construction either this season or have a small piece next season. But they are all moving forward expeditiously.
How important do you think these initial projects, Vineyard Wind 1, South Fork, and the next few projects, the success of those projects is to the foundational ability to just get this entire industry off the ground in the next few years in North America?
Well, thank you for that question. It's my view that it's critically important to show that these projects can be built in the U.S., that the U.S. has a market available for offshore wind, that the federal government knows how to permit these projects and can get them up and running, and communities can benefit from that clean energy flowing to the grid.
Let's dig down a little bit on that permitting issue. In February, I led a letter to the president with 5 other senators, but also including a number of senators on this committee, identifying our concerns about permitting delays at BOEM. And in particular, just that timelines are frequently slowed down by the lack of interagency coordination on environmental consultations and reviews, staff shortages as well. So I'm curious, since you've taken the helm at BOEM, what are you doing to alleviate these permitting delays? How have you been working with other related interagency groups like the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council and CEQ to support BOEM in its permitting decisions, and particularly in sort of compressing the timetables?
Yep. Thank you very much for that question. I think as with many large infrastructure projects, sources of delays often come from agencies not having full communication structures set up and collaboration. I'm happy to say that my colleague Janet Coit and I spend a lot of time together. We see each other every week, sometimes every day, and just to work through issues as they come up so that we can resolve them. Capacity issues are real at our agencies, and I know that NOAA also suffers from the capacity constraints given the volume of work before them. And I know that our FY23 budgets suggest some reasonable ways to approach those capacity problems. FIPSI has been incredibly helpful in just providing the transparency about where projects are in their process through the dashboard. They also have been tremendously helpful in making sure to convene groups, including the project proponents, to work through difficult issues.
Do you feel like you're moving from sort of an ad hoc relationship with other agencies to a more formalized, regular, transparent process where everybody kind of knows when there's a problem and can dig in on the hard issues to get that solved?
Absolutely. One of the first things I did upon taking the role was to make sure that I knew all of the main leadership contacts at agencies that have some permitting responsibility in these infrastructure projects, make sure that the BOEM leadership that's in charge of the renewable energy program also has those contacts in place, and that we're communicating on a regular basis and have a governance structure set up to make sure that we're working through interagency collaboration.
One of the things in our letter to the president that we identified that is a unique transmission challenge associated with offshore wind that is different than, for example, onshore wind and some of the transmission, interregional transmission we're building in other parts of the country, is that currently BOEM's regulations really only contemplate leaseholders building their own radial export cables. Like every project has its own extension cord to the continent. When what we really need is the ability to share those things to develop what are essentially ocean grids. And if you do that, you also reduce the overall gross impact on the marine environment as well. How do we move from the way this was initially assumed to play out to something that's more effective and more efficient sort of an ocean grid strategy as opposed to every single project having their own tie to the continent?
Yes, thank you for the question. We have been working quite extensively on this issue, including with our partners at the Department of Energy, and recently put out an action plan around transmission on the Atlantic to address some of these very issues. In the short term, we know how important it is to get projects up and running, and so the individual tie lines, allowing that to happen in order to get the industry going, to get those supply chains moving. But in the medium to long-term planning horizons, starting to work on more of a grid structure. Our energy grid in this country is obviously complicated, lots of different actors involved, and we're making sure that we're working with state and local jurisdictions to work on these complicated issues.
Thank you, Chairman.
Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you and the ranking member have been to Alaska. You know we have people that live there. You've seen it. You've witnessed it. It's not just me and my family. But yet, I get this very distinct impression that those within the Biden administration think that we're just a snow globe up there and we look pretty on the shelf. And this 5-year plan, I have to tell you, is just yet one more case in point. It makes perfectly clear to me that the Department of Interior, the Biden administration, have no concern for energy security. The ranking member pointed out you'd rather go to Iran, to Venezuela. But you also don't care about the energy affordability for the people who are most energy vulnerable. Some of the most energy vulnerable people in the United States of America happen to be living in Alaska, and they're Alaskan natives. Again, people that the administration professes to care about. It's almost like the people there are just a burden. Well, they're not a burden to me, but you have a 5-year plan here where you have determined that there are no lease sales offered in Alaska due to, quote, the relatively small population. Okay, that's a true statement. We only have 720,000 people. And the lack of industrialization. Even though you acknowledge that holding no lease sales is going to result in higher energy prices, resulting in the highest economic burden for those who can least afford it, higher emissions for any alternative sources of energy. So we're trying to do the right thing and find other alternatives here. But the fact of the matter is we're going to be looking to dirtier sources to replace it so that we can keep the lights on and keep homes warm in a cold place. And our other alternative right now is turning to Canada for importing LNG to keep the lights on in South Central, where most of the population, where half of the population is. I'm having to sit down with my utility managers across the state as they're telling me, Lisa, you better get used to it because we got to be making some contracts with Canada for LNG over my dead body. We have the resources there. We've demonstrated, we had the longest term export contract with Japan for our LNG for decades. We've got the resource here. Are you aware that we have this shortage in Cook Inlet right now that's going to impact Alaska residents?
Well, thank you for the question, Senator. I had the opportunity to travel to Alaska over the summer, twice actually, once for vacation, once for work, but and did a number of productive meetings with the state, including.
So do you know though,
yes,
that this is what we're looking at right now?
Yes,
that with no exploration opportunities, we're looking to Canada. Do you know that the decision here, the selection of no lease sales in Cook Inlet is going to impact our energy prices in Alaska? Do you understand that?
I understand there is a shortage of natural gas in Cook Inlet. We also have 15 leases, I think, as you know, in the Cook Inlet currently waiting for a proposed production plan for those leases. I met with the leaseholder while I was in Alaska, and BOEM stands ready to review and any proposal that's put in front of us for those leases.
So let me tell you part of the problem with those leases, and this relates to lease sale 258. You are aware, I'm assuming, of the decision memo from your boss. This is Amanda Lefton to Laura Daniel Davis. This was back in November 25 of 2022 regarding the decision for the size, the timing, location, and the economic conditions for that lease sale. I'm sure you're familiar with that, okay. Well, for those who might not know, it's a memo that the director of BOEM recommended a higher royalty rate of 18.75% for lease sale 258, specifically adding a surcharge of 2.25 percentage points to, quote, account for the social cost of upstream greenhouse gas emissions from production. So your memo goes on to say, well, a 16.75% royalty may be more likely to facilitate expeditious and orderly development of OCS resources and potentially offer greater energy security to the residents of the state of Alaska, a reasonable balancing of the environmental and the economic factors for the American public favors the maximum 18.75% royalty for Cook Inlet leases. So you've got a situation here where you are purposefully seeking to increase the costs to Alaskan residents because you want to favor the American public in some other part of the country. I don't know where or how. But you've got a lower royalty rate would have increased energy security. It would have worked to address our cost challenges. But this is not compatible with BOEM's paper. I mean, we look at this and say, we view that you think of us as nothing more than a burden here. So when you're wondering why you can't get interest in your lease sales, maybe you need to be looking to some of the self-imposed barriers that the administration is placing on us. But we are not going to be in a place where, as a state that has resources, as a state that has demonstrated a responsible use and stewardship of our resources, not only for our benefit, but for the benefit of other Americans and to our friends and allies. We need to work with you. But what has happened, and this example is just case in point of an administration that has determined that Alaska is just to be something pretty to look at. And the fact that people like you can go up there and have a nice vacation is great, but we need jobs that are better than just packing your bags when you get there. I'm sorry that I'm a little irritated, but this is stunning to me. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. No, I'm not sorry.
Well, I knew you weren't. I will say this, the 18 was never intended to be, except for basically keeping the balance that we have in the Gulf right now. That was the only time. That's why the 18, the 16 and 18, the slide, you all took it to the highest level everywhere you could. That was not the intent. The intent was to match the 18 that's in the Gulf, keep it at 18. We didn't want to go down to 16 in the Gulf, but it was never intended to go to 18 in Cook Inlet or any of the shallow waters. With that, we have Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you guys for being here. Let's start. Ms. Klein, there's bipartisan understanding of the role critical minerals, essential minerals, are going to play in our evolving energy economy. Wind turbines rely on rare earth elements, other critical minerals, essential minerals. As BOEM oversees minerals on our outer continental shelf, how is your agency looking at critical minerals as a part of the broader clean energy strategy? Are you concerned about supply chain disruptions slowing down the progress on offshore wind deployment?
Well, thank you very much for the question. On critical minerals, from just the BOEM perspective, we know that the Outer Continental Shelf has the potential for critical minerals development. There's not a lot of information and data right now about where those resources are. There's not a lot of data on the type of mining activities that might be used to obtain those resources. And so at BOEM, we are undertaking a process to build up an inventory of offshore critical minerals. We're also playing a role at the U.S. as an observer country, the International Seabed Authority, and making sure that we're providing our expertise there. But certainly, critical minerals development is something we believe to be a priority. And as we don't have any applications in front of us currently for critical minerals development on the OCS, but are building up our expertise and program to make sure that we're ready when they come. And supply chain generally is a challenge that the offshore wind industry is facing all across the world. And so, you know, the BOEM and this administration have put a priority on ensuring that we are building up a domestic supply chain here in the U.S., building up the type of manufacturing hubs and supporting U.S. jobs here to build out this industry.
Great. And I think it's just interesting. It's going to be as the possibility rises and values and costs adjust, the environmental conditions at the outer shelf are not sufficiently well studied either. So I think there's needs to be a real focus on looking at how much material would have to be moved, what would that do to the conditions, what is the condition of the aquatic environment were that to happen. I'm very concerned about essential minerals, but I think that you guys are going to have to balance this very carefully. Also, just the goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by the end of the decade. Are we on schedule, do you think, to be able to make that?
Well, thank you for the question. We know it's a bold, but we still think achievable goal. We know the industry is facing a lot of its own headwinds with, as I mentioned, supply chain issues and increasing costs, but we're continuing to move forward. We have about approximately 27 gigawatts or so that we believe will come to decisions around permitting by 2025. And we are focusing on additional lease sales that will allow for more projects in the future.
Great. That's somewhat optimistic. Let's see there. I guess the last question, the NRAIL was doing a study looking at transmission in from the Atlantic, and where are we with that study? Just because I think what Senator Heinrich was talking about is critically important, as well as making sure we have a big wires act that is looking at how do you connect regional hubs of energy consumption and generation. How do you make sure we have energy going to where it needs to be?
Sure. I'd have to get back to you on the exact status of the NREL study that you're referring to, but as I mentioned, we are working through these issues with our colleagues at Department of Energy, which have lots of experience on transmission issues, and we've put out an action plan for the Atlantic. We're hoping to also move forward on a similar planning effort on the Pacific. We know that the variety of recommendations about what to do in the short, medium, and long term might include a mix of executive actions and also, potentially legislative fixes. And so we're looking forward to continuing to work with this committee on those issues.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that both of you are doing such important work in terms of balancing the environment with the need for, if we don't have essential critical minerals, our battles against climate change will stop in their tracks. So you've got the driving you a sense of urgency there, but at the same time, it's not worth it if we sacrifice our environment. Thank you. I'll yield back to the chair.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Hickley. We have Senator Cassidy.
Yeah, and I would argue that we're not going to make our same progress against climate change if we choose to get our oil and gas resources from areas of the world that have lower environmental standards. It's been documented by a national lab that the production in the Gulf of Mexico has the lowest carbon intensity of any oil that comes to our nation to be refined. Since we know we're going to be using oil, why not get it where there's a lower carbon intensity and, oh, by the way, creates American jobs? So, Ms. Coit, there's been a kind of perception that this administration is intent upon killing with the death of 1,000 cuts domestic oil and gas production. Tell me how this 10-mile-per-hour limit on speed on boats in the Gulf of Mexico applied only to those involved with oil and gas industry, not the military, not the recreation, not the fishing, not the, you name it, only to those, how this doesn't represent hostility by the administration to the jobs that the working Americans have in that industry.
Thank you, Senator, for that question. The I want to deconflate two things. There is a biological opinion from 2020 that requires a 10-knot speed for the oil and gas industry in the core Rice's Whale area.
Now,
Which is in
define core.
It's in the eastern part of the Gulf.
Eastern.
Yeah, there was a map. I don't think you were in the room.
I saw it. So it's eastern, not stretching to the Texas coast.
That's where the current vessel speed restriction applies. I think you're also then referencing the, there is a
stretch across the Gulf of Mexico, where there's been only one confirmed sighting of a rice whale, period, end of story. Others are unconfirmed, and yet it applies only to vessels involved with offshore gas development.
The reason for that is it was the result of a Section 7 consultation under the Endangered Species Act for a federal action related to oil and gas development when we considered impact.
If it were really considered that important, you would stretch beyond that section into all others. Now, we can leave it as another argument as to whether or not it's justified. The setting of one whale and no other that has been confirmed to have something which is so far-reaching is, again, the reason why folks think this is a part of a pattern of a death of 1,000 cuts of all the jobs associated for working Americans in that industry. Succinctly, can you tell me why that perception would not be true?
I don't believe it's true. I believe we're able to implement the Endangered Species Act while allowing productive oil and gas development.
But 10 miles per hour does not allow for productive oil and gas.
And that we've done that. At the moment, I think you're referring to a proposed critical habitat map when you're talking about the sightings. And I believe you were out of the room when I mentioned that we also have consistent passive acoustic monitoring that demonstrates.
I'm told that there's been no confirmed sighting, and the one that had been proposed by the Coast Guard was later retracted because they said that it was the wrong species, and so that there is no evidence. It's just, let's find a reason to justify the rule.
The rule is intended to mitigate threats to Rice's whale, and we have the best available science demonstrating that they.
There's always kind of
and
I don't mean this to be offensive, but the last refuge of the scoundrel, and I don't mind calling you a scoundrel, I'm just making a quote. The last refuge of the scoundrel is saying that's what the science says. And we've seen consistently how that's been used to manipulate the American people. Yes, at times science clearly says something. It clearly does. But at other times that's kind of a refuge for a rule. Well, science says it, so therefore we've got to go there. There has been one confirmed sighting of a rice whale outside that core area, ever. And that's being used to create a band from Florida to Texas through which, in an uneconomical way, vessels required to develop outer continental shelf oil can only go at 10 miles per hour. But no other vessel, not military, not recreational, not fishing, et cetera. Now, if you're the guy and the gal making your living, sending your kid to a better school because you work in an industry related to that, as many in Louisiana and other areas do, you got to feel like you got a big target on you by the Biden administration. They're coming after me. They're coming after my job. They don't care about me. They just care about their agenda, which tends to be ideological and not associated with my own economic needs. And that's what the science says is the easy kind of rope-a-dope. But there's been one sighting. I've used all my time on this one rant, and I apologize. Thank you.
Okay. Senator, I think it's up to you now. Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been most interesting of hearing this discussion back and forth, and it's very, very telling. But it is important because the evidence of this administration's assault on domestic fuel energy production is abundantly clear, to the total detriment of so many. On top of the late 5-year plan that was supposed to be completed and released more than a year ago, the administration has proposed a plan that obviously won't have any offshore lease sales in 2024. None, zero. The last time that happened, the year was 1966, and LBJ was president. What's worse is that there is no guarantee the only 3 lease sales in this 5-year plan will ever even take place. But I'm putting my money on the administration doing everything they can to ensure that it doesn't. We know that offshore oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico, I'm from Mississippi, that is a Gulf state. It is the gold standard when it comes to producing energy in line with our nation's environmental standards that are very rigorous. Our producers' record consistently surpasses bad actors such as Russia, Venezuela, China, OPEC, and even Iran. Those foreign producers, they don't adhere or frankly even care about those standards. And so many in this room today, you have said how important these good standards are. I assure you these countries do not care about that. Yes, this administration continues to limit the domestic production that is better while encouraging those very countries to produce more oil. None of this seems to be rational at all. I have a 2-part question, and it's to you, Ms. Klein. In this 5-year leasing plan, how does a drawdown of offshore leases to the lowest OCS lease sales in history not embolden our adversaries when it comes to energy dominance?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Certainly, as the proposed final program is put together, energy security and the global market for oil and gas is something that's considered. I believe the administration's focus on transitioning to clean energy and tapping into domestic sources of clean energy is a way that continues our energy dominance.
What about national security?
Well, thank you again. National security is something that is also considered throughout the process in putting together the proposed final program. The transition to cleaner energy sources here at home is something that we believe helps facilitate energy security, and the proposed final program and the direction in the Inflation Reduction Act certainly led to the Secretary proposing the minimum number of sales needed to continue to expand the offshore wind program.
Do you think this country is safer because of that?
In their tallies that the total number of votes cast is 429.
Thank you for the question. I don't believe that the proposed final program has made this country any less safe.
You truly do not believe that. What's the administration's rationale for not utilizing the Gulf of Mexico to its fullest potential to combat the threat of the United States again becoming dependent on hostile nations for energy? What's your rationale for that?
Well, thank you for the question. The documents and all of the analytics provided in the proposed final program, I think, go into some detail about the role that Gulf of Mexico oil plays in the global energy markets. The Secretary, based on all of the factors that she's required to consider, including impacts to the environment and the administration's goal to hit net zero pathways by 2035, as a result of all of that work, concluded that the 3 lease sales best meet our energy needs for the next 5 years.
It meets our energy needs, but does it make us safe? Congress enacted the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act primarily to facilitate the federal government's leasing of its offshore mineral resources and energy resources. In this law, Congress expressly stated that offshore resources should be made available for expeditious and orderly development. Ms. Klein, what assurances will you give us today that BOEM will not impose burdensome stipulations that make new leases economically unacceptable and therefore basically unavailable for development, contrary to this clear congressional intent?
Well, again, thank you for the question. The proposed final program outlines 3 potential sales that would take place in 25, 27, and 29. We Secretary still has
And you
a
think that's
decision
going to
issue.
happen? Do you think that that's going to happen?
I believe that the Inflation Reduction Act provided clear direction on requiring oil and gas lease sales to happen in order to continue to expand the offshore wind leasing program. That's certainly something the administration is committed to, transitioning our nation to cleaner energy sources.
I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, and I hate it badly.
Hang in there, you're going to get another shot. Okay, I'm gonna go with my questions now since I deferred to Senator King's questions, and then we'll see. Do you have any second round?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and Senator Smith, do you have second round? You want to ask some second round questions? I'll get back to you. I'm going to go through mine, and I'll go to John next, okay? Ms. Klein, without the IRA, would there have been any offshore oil and gas lease sales held or reinstated in 2022 or 2023 in your best estimation?
Well, thank you for the question. I think the Inflation Reduction Act was clear.
No, we're
and-
saying without it. If it never happened, it came very close to not happening at all.
Well, thank you for the question, and I respect the question. I find it very difficult to speculate on things
Let me say
that
this.
may happen.
Was
but
the administration considering zero oil and gas sales for the next 5-year plan? So there would not have been a 5-year plan with any gas and oil sales?
Well, again, the Inflation Reduction Act was provided us with clear direction. I think was certainly part of the decision-making process to include
no one
three
knew it was going
proposed
to
sales.
happen. They really did not know. The administration did not know there was going to be an IRA, I can assure you. And you all were planning. You had plenty of time to plan because that didn't happen until June. So I'm just asking, were they going down a zero path for no leases for 5 years?
Respectfully, I cannot say what
Okay.
would have happened without it.
On your testimony that noted an appeal is pending on the Fifth Circuit that could impact lease sale 261, Ms. Klein, which has already been delayed to November the 8th. As you know, the statutory deadline for the sale in the IRA was September the 30th. And I was really befuddled and dismayed by its delay. Can you help clarify us if you're in fact committed to holding the sale on November the 8th?
Well, thank you for the question. All systems are go for the sale on November 8th. We don't see anything in the way of holding that sale.
Good, thank you. Administrator Coit, in addition to the energy industry, the sport fishing, recreational, and boating and commercial fishing industries have a tremendous impact on our economy. We cannot overregulate to the point where small businesses cannot function and local economies are struggling every day. The past summer, I secured a provision in the Senate fiscal year 24 Commerce, Justice, and Science funding bill that requires NOAA to engage with affected stakeholders, including the recreational boating and fishing communities, before NOAA issues any interim or final rule on vessel speeds. Can you give me the situation that you all have and what your considerations are by looking at the fiscal 24 appropriations bill and provide us with an update on the current status of vessel speed, the vessel speed rule?
Thank you, Senator. And I sure hope we get an FY24 appropriations bill. As you know, because we were talking about the Gulf before, I believe you're now talking about the North Atlantic right whale and the Atlantic.
So you'll know that the recreational and the sport fishing and all those things, they said they were never contacted at all. So that's why we had to put that in there. They weren't consulted before you all started considering the 10-mile,
Yep.
10 knots.
I have such respect for that sector, and I interact with them a lot. I know they were frustrated that there wasn't more interaction, and I've had a number of meetings subsequently. And I think it's very, very important for us to coordinate with the recreational fishing sector. And they, in fact, are working with us now on some workshops.
Are you all close to coming to a ruling on the 10?
So on the proposed rule, the comment period on the proposed rule closed a year ago, actually. And we've been carefully considering and analyzing those comments and working.
I'm sure you've been inundated.
There were over 90,000 comments.
I knew that.
And so we're in the process.
They weren't positive.
They were on all sides of the issue.
The majority.
Because it is a critically endangered whale, and we know that vessel strikes are one of the reasons that
We're
they're
talking about,
dying.
I live on a boat, okay? I can tell you, anytime I take the boat out, I'm not looking for a whale to hit. and I've never seen a well that I could have hit. Now, a well could have hit me maybe, but, and I can tell you also, I checked with the insurance agency on claims. There is none. So basically, if I got hit, or if I hit one, I'd have a lot of damage, and I would turn it into my insurance agency. So I'm saying nothing shows the justification of even thinking that that would be a positive way to go, and it's going to help anything, except hurt an industry that's struggling. I'm just saying, hopefully you'll make a common sense decision on this one when it's overwhelming. There's nothing that justifies what the consideration. And whoever brought this to you, I know it wasn't yours. I know you all didn't originate it. I'll give you credit for that. But I think you all have accelerated to the point of looking at something that's really not a problem.
I don't want to take credit where it's not due. We did originate the proposed
Oh, the
rule
tin-
for the
oh, okay.
for the North
I'm
Atlantic
sorry,
right
and I'm
whale.
more upset with
and
you than I
we
was.
are responding to a petition in the Gulf in regard to a vessel speed. But I thank you for your input, and I know that's an issue that's really important to you and to the
So
sport fishing sector.
you'll either make a statement after you have the period of time, but the period of time's already exceeded. When do you all plan on doing this? So it's people aren't left in limbo. That's the problem.
Yeah, for the final rule, we've consistently let people know that we hope to make a decision by the end of the year for the vessel speed rule
Okay.
affecting North Atlantic right whales, and that is our goal.
End of the year. Okay, thank you. Senator Brasso.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Klein, last week before the House, you were asked some questions. One was about your involvement in the voluntary settlement agreement involving the Rice's whale in July. You avoided the question, so please just yes or no. Were you consulted, informed, or otherwise involved in the settlement agreement involving the Rice's whale?
Well, thank you for the question. There is, from BOEM's perspective, we share NOAA's concerns about the status of the Rice's whale in the Gulf of Mexico, and we put forward some voluntary recommended measures in a notice to lessees to try and address potential impacts to the Rice's whale.
So you were consulted by what you just said. So I'd note that the lawsuit at issue did not involve your agency. So was the decision to impose restrictions on the leases and remove 6 million acres from the lease sale 261 a coordinated effort across the administration? Or was it principally your decision as the director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management?
Well, thank you for the question. Again, we proposed some what we believe to be reasonable measures to address potential impacts to a critically endangered species in the Gulf of Mexico. We are tied up in litigation in several cases around these lease sales. But from BOEM's perspective, again, we share NOAA's concerns about the status of this critically endangered species. And right now, there are recommended measures that companies can take. And I know that from speaking to oil and gas companies, they share our concerns about making sure that their activities are done in a sustainable, safe, and environmentally protective way. So we hope we can continue to work forward to make sure that this species doesn't go extinct on our watch.
So as we've heard then from Senator Hyde-Smith, Senator Murkowski, Senator Cassidy, offshore energy production is critically important to our U.S. economy and our U.S. national security. The decision that you make have enormous consequences for this country, for coastal states, for American workers. I know you have a lot of concerns about the globe. I'm talking about American coastal states, American workers, American citizens, our country, where affordable energy matters. Would you support legislation requiring the Senate to confirm the person who holds your position, the director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, because right now it's not a confirmable position?
Well, thank you for the question. And as always, my Bureau and the Department of Interior and the administration stands ready to provide technical assistance to any proposed legislation that is put before us and provide administration positions. So we're ready to do that if there's a proposal.
But you don't have a vision of whether that should be a confirmable position or not in terms of the role that it plays in our nation's economy and the jobs?
Right now, personally, I am focused on doing the best job that I can as Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and implementing the President's agenda to address climate change and ensure that the federal government is doing something to address that crisis.
So along that line, the 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030, the Biden administration has set that goal. You're involved in generating 30 gigawatts of electricity from offshore wind by the year 2030. So 2 weeks ago, Politico ran a story. Mr. Chairman, I asked it submitted to the record. The headline, Pipe Dream. Biden's offshore wind plan takes a hit. A quarter of the power plan from ocean turbines by 2030 is facing delays and cancellations. The about 7.5 gigawatts. The article quotes an analyst from Bloomberg New Energy Finance saying U.S. targets are further from reality. I've been saying it was a pipe dream at the beginning of the year. My opinion is even stronger today. So when are you going to end the happy talk and admit that 30 gigawatts is not going to be available by 2030? And don't you really owe the country frank and candid assessment as energy prices continue to go up, as your role makes us less reliant on affordable, available energy and more focused on what is a pipe dream? And, you know, we have people responsible for keeping the lights on, and we're not being helped along the way by misleading the public. So when are you going to fess up and admit that you're not going to meet the goals that you've decided upon or are so critical?
Well, thank you for the question. I think at BOEM, we really, we believe in American ingenuity, innovation, and hard work. We're rolling up our sleeves to make sure that we can work through the hard problems associated with the build-out of a brand-new industry here in the U.S. We hear from folks every day about how they believe that the transition to cleaner energy sources, including offshore wind, which is the only industrial-scale clean energy source available to certain East Coast communities. I believe that these are hard problems, and we have the ability to work through them. We already have 2 projects that are under construction, another 2 that have been approved, and we have approximately 27 gigawatts in the pipeline with more to come in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, and I know that there's been a lot of discussion and will continue to be about the Rice's well issue. But I've heard from many of my constituents on how the rushed and totally unjustified proposed rule from the National Marine Fisheries Services could affect their jobs. The ramifications would extend to serious issues in the supply chain, the economy, energy production, and national security. Ms. Coed, I want to talk about the vessel restrictions. I know that you had given an answer earlier on why just oil and gas was targeted. Can you say that again? I'm not sure I quite understood that answer.
Thanks, Senator, and thank you for the question. And if you'll bear with me, there's a proposed rule for proposed critical habitat. That is out for public comment right now. That does not involve vessel speed restrictions.
So has that public comment period ended, though?
The public, no, it has not ended. It went out for in June, or it went out this summer for public comment, and we are in the public comment period.
Okay, continue, please.
Let me make sure that's correct. Maybe I think let me just double check that. But it went out this summer for public comment. That is for critical habitat. It does not involve a vessel speed restriction. We have a petition in front of us for a broad vessel speed restriction that we have not acted upon yet, but I expect to act on soon. And then I believe what you're referring to is the outcome of our consultation with BOEM and Bessie that did impose a vessel speed restriction on the oil and gas industry as part of the reasonable and prudent alternatives that were included to reduce mortality to endangered Rice's whales.
So you're saying prudent and reasonable. Do the oil and gas ships do more damage than any other vessel?
It's under the Endangered Species Act, we are consulting with agencies around their plans. This was a consultation around the oil and gas program, and that is what we are working on in terms of the activities that we're advising on. And so vessel strikes we know to be one of the risk factors for endangered rice's whales, and that is why that vessel speed restriction. I might also add that they spend a lot of time at the surface at night, so there's also a restriction except for safety at transit during the dark times.
Does your agency plan to restrict any other vessels, or you're just going to stay there? Does it plan to apply restrictive mitigation requirements to vessels beyond the oil and gas industry? Is that in the making, or you're just going to stick with oil and gas?
In regard to the Endangered Species Act, we consult around agency actions, and that would be true in terms of the proposed critical habitat. We do have a petition in front of us to broaden those vessel speed restrictions that we expect to act on soon, and so as soon as we do, I'll make sure that we get in touch.
Okay, and if you do that, if that happens, how do you plan to analyze the economic impacts to such mitigations? Is there a plan to, are you just strictly looking at one thing, or are you looking at the bigger picture of the possible economic impacts?
So for the petition in front of us, if we acted to deny it, there would be no further action. If we approved it, we would go out with a proposed rule that would analyze economic impacts and where we would invite public comment.
Okay, and regarding critical habitat designations for endangered species, is it normal business for your agency to rely on unpublished reports that haven't been finalized as the basis for such impactful determinations?
Thank you for that question. For the proposed rule on critical habitat for Rice's whale, we relied on many peer-reviewed reports. You're referring to one report that is not yet published. However, all of the information, the model, the technical information has already appeared in published reports. So the information we're relying on is something that is available to the public to comment on.
Are any of the peer reviewers directly employed by NMFS?
Thank you for that question. I would have to get back to you. Our employees are part of many of the published studies, including the one I just referenced, and I would have to get back to you in terms of the peer review process and whether we're participating in that for the various studies we're relying on.
Okay, I would really like that answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Before we adjourn, Ms. Klein, I just wanted to correct something because I think I asked a question. If it had not been for the IRA, would there have been any lease sales? And I will say, that, and maybe you've forgotten, that lease 259, 260, and 261 were canceled in May of 2022, and the bill wasn't passed until June of 2022. So it pretty much shows the intention of having no oil and gas lease sales. With that,
Senator, could I correct the record? I knew I just misspoke. Excuse me. I'm so sorry
Absolutely.
for interrupting. But just even though the senator already left, the public comment period did close earlier this month for the critical habitat designation. I just couldn't remember which
no problem.
day
We'll
it
make
closed.
sure of
Thank you.
any of those corrections. Anybody has any further comments to be made, you can just add them to the record. And we're going to have, all members will have until close of business tomorrow to submit additional questions for the record, and we will allow you all to do the same if you wanted to submit anything that could be of a correction. So with that, the committee stands adjourned.